The true puppet master controlling the modern world's weak men is not a woman outside, but the ghost of a woman trapped inside their own mind. We have spent centuries analyzing the pathologies of female repression, but we have criminally ignored the central psychological catastrophe of the modern male, the possession or the hostile takeover of his own soul by his unintegrated feminine principle, the anima. This is not integration. This is psychological slavery, where the masculine drive is neutered and replaced by an anxious, needy, and relationally dependent internal tyrant. The soft atrophy we see across culture, the men who cannot commit, who are paralyzed by comfort, who prioritize feelings above truth, and who navigate the world via passive-aggressive manipulation, are not inherently weak. They are possessed. Their ambition has been outsourced to the inner woman, which demands safety, emotional consensus, and the complete annihilation of risk, thus ensuring the man remains small enough to control. This essay is not an exercise in gender politics. It is an autopsy of the male soul. The anima, originally intended by nature to be a bridge to depth, creativity, and emotional wisdom, curdles into a corrosive acid when neglected or treated with contempt. When the man refuses the difficult work of embodying his own logos, his meaning, his disciplined reason, and his mission, that vacuum is instantly filled by a hysterical, demanding counterforce. This possessed man, or the puer aeternus suffering from anima inflation, manifests specific and devastating behavioral patterns. He becomes hypersensitive, prone to projection, and is perpetually wounded by critique. His internal parliament, which should be governed by the decisive, boundary-setting king, is instead run by the anxious queen who vetoes every aggressive, assertive, or demanding move, fearing conflict above all else. His primary concern shifts from building his outer world to managing his inner emotional state and the external validation he receives. If you are exhausted by the shallow self-help industry's insistence that you simply need to manifest or be positive, and if you are ready to confront the dangerous, insidious machinery of your own psyche, then you need to commit to this journey right now. Hit that subscribe button and do not miss the rest of this analysis, because the truth of your own internal struggle is far darker and far more powerful than you currently believe. The possession takes root when the man fails to differentiate from his maternal complex. He carries the internalized expectation that the world, or his partner, must provide the boundless, non-judgmental comfort of the mother. He is, in essence, trying to mate with a mother, not a woman, and he seeks a relationship that functions as a psychological womb. When this occurs, the internal anima, feeling validated in her omnipotence, begins to dictate life from the shadow. We see the emergence of the relational man, the one who defines his success purely by the quality of his relationships, who sacrifices his own personal drive on the altar of domestic harmony, and who, ironically, becomes incapable of being a true partner because he has nothing singular or independent left to offer. He ceases to be a force and becomes merely a reflection. He transforms his ambition into a neurotic dependence on his partner's opinion, needing constant emotional mirroring to confirm his own value. He will subconsciously test his partner's dedication by presenting weakness, hoping to trigger the maternal response, thereby confirming his internal blueprint. But the anima possession is not always soft and comforting. Often it is a demanding tyrant of sentimentality. The man becomes obsessively concerned with fairness, with justice defined by emotional parity, and with moralizing everything, viewing the world through a lens of victimhood that grants him perpetual innocence while allowing him to judge the assertiveness of others. This is the phenomenon of the feminized critique, where the man, unable to assert his own will, asserts the will of his inner moralistic judge onto the world, usually through passive-aggressive sabotage or intellectual condescension. When the masculine principle is absent, it leaves behind an emotional infrastructure that is exquisitely sensitive but utterly defenseless, easily overwhelmed by the slightest external pressure. He may appear outwardly rational, often retreating into intellectualism as a shield, but beneath the veneer, he is entirely governed by emotional tides he refuses to name, let alone master. The classic symptom is the inability to take a definitive, hard position that might risk upsetting someone. He would rather dissolve the boundary entirely than face the conflict necessary to maintain it. This internal tyranny doesn't just soften the man, it makes him dishonest. Because the Anima demands consensus and emotional safety, the possessed man finds it psychologically impossible to deliver hard truths. He becomes expert at deflection, evasion, and masking his resentment behind a facade of placid agreement. This psychological mechanism guarantees that genuine intimacy is impossible, because intimacy requires the courage to present one's hard edges, one's true desires, and one's independent will. Instead, he presents a malleable self, a reflection of what he perceives the environment requires. This perpetual dishonesty is the deep secret of Anima possession. The man loses the capacity for integrity, substituting genuine commitment to his own purpose with a commitment to maintaining a fragile, emotionally protected internal and external environment. He dreams of greatness, but wakes up paralyzed by the fear of causing a ripple. The Anima whispers, "If you strive too hard, if you risk too much, you will be abandoned, you will be unloved." And the possessed man, terrified of that deep, archaic loneliness, always obeys the whisper, choosing the shadow of comfort over the blazing light of his own destiny. He remains tethered perpetually to the invisible chain of his inner wife. The deepest root of this suffering is not a mere preference for comfort, but a catastrophic confusion of love with identity. The possessed man was conditioned, often in early life, to believe that his value, his very right to exist, was contingent upon his emotional management of the external environment, usually his primary caregiver. If he expressed robust will, if he pursued independent achievement that pulled him away from the gravitational center of the home, it triggered anxiety, resentment, or withdrawal in those he needed most. The child learns, quickly and brutally, that aggressive assertion or singular ambition is not merely rude, but an existential threat. The Anima, originally designed to integrate emotion and sensitivity, assumes tyrannical control because she promises survival through compliance. She whispers, "Stay small, stay agreeable, and you will not be abandoned." This promise of safety is the drug he cannot quit, yet the withdrawal symptoms, the constant low-level anxiety of being discovered as a fraud, are what define his life. If you find this analysis cutting through the noise and exposing a hidden truth, consider hitting the subscribe button now, because we will not stop digging until we find the core architecture of the modern psychological prison. This bondage is reinforced by a modern culture that actively pathologizes the very masculine virtues necessary for liberation. We have created a peculiar social environment where emotional sensitivity is lauded, but genuine emotional resilience is treated as a form of callous detachment. The possessed man is often praised for his nuance and his listening skills, qualities that are, in this context, just symptoms of his refusal to draw a line in the sand. His suffering is thus culturally validated. He is applauded for his passivity, mistaking the absence of conflict for moral superiority. He becomes the perfect bureaucratic man, adept at navigating complex social rules, exquisitely polite, eternally non-committal, and internally rotting with resentment because he never allows himself the full, terrifying expression of his unique purpose. The cost of this safety is the erosion of meaning itself. Meaning is found in friction, in the active imposition of one's will onto the chaos of the world, in the necessary suffering that accompanies risk. The Anima-possessed man who has outsourced his will to the demands of perceived consensus exists in a state of perpetual existential anesthesia. He has gained the whole world of comfort and lost his soul. The soul being defined here as the unique, unrepeatable tension between what he is and what he could be. He suffers from an overwhelming sense of low-grade futility, a shadow hanging over every achievement, because he knows deep down that the man achieving these things is not his true self, but a meticulously constructed proxy designed for maximum approval. This internal void is the worst punishment the psyche can deliver. The silent, gnawing realization that one's life is merely a successful performance of someone else's script. If you appreciate essays that refuse to shy away from the complex and sometimes brutal mechanisms of the human psyche, and want to ensure this kind of deep, unapologetic content can continue to exist, please take a moment to subscribe and support the channel. The final tragic twist is that the suffering man then projects his self-betrayal onto the world. Because he cannot tolerate the feeling of being shackled to his inner wife, he becomes obsessed with imposing order and control externally, primarily by policing the passion and self-assertion of others. He turns his repressed ambition into moralistic tyranny. He diagnoses the healthy aggression of others, the drive to compete, the willingness to risk offense for a belief, the sheer joy of independent action, as toxicity, privilege, or ego. He becomes the self-appointed gatekeeper of emotional maturity, which defined through his lens means never challenging the status quo and always prioritizing collective feeling over individual truth. This is the point where his internal paralysis becomes an external political weapon. He must dismantle the masculine principle wherever he sees it flourish, because its very existence mocks his carefully constructed prison of safety. His suffering is not just personal, it is contagious, spreading paralysis and resentment through every system he touches. He is a man who dreams of freedom but dedicates his waking life to building higher walls around the very people who might show him the way out. He is the ultimate victim who secretly desires to be the ultimate censor. He seeks not justice, but psychological symmetry. If he cannot be free, no one else is permitted to exhibit freedom without being immediately labeled a threat to the fragile collective. This is precisely how the institutionalization of paralysis occurs. Watch how systems and corporations are now structured, less around efficiency or genuine innovation, and more around the meticulous management of emotional risk. The man who failed to become himself becomes the architect of the bureaucratic machine that ensures no one else ever successfully tries. His greatest triumph is the creation of a culture, often disguised under the therapeutic banner of psychological safety, where the highest virtue is compliance and the greatest sin is the introduction of disruptive, asymmetrical truth. This is not the safety required for honest disagreement. It is the safety of the womb, a smothering blanket designed to extinguish the heat of aggressive intelligence. Consider the modern corporate review structure, the ultimate expression of this man's revenge against the self he sacrificed. In true, high-stakes environments, conflict and merit are inseparable. Ideas must fight, competence must be measurable, and genuine feedback must be painful enough to prompt real change. But in the paralyzed man's world, meritocracy is rebranded as privilege, and passionate debate is filtered through a mandatory lexicon of non-offensive jargon. The brutally honest appraisal is censored. The man who challenges the consensus, the innovator who risks offense by pointing out the emperor's nakedness, is not praised for his insight, but disciplined for his lack of emotional maturity or low social intelligence. The system actively rewards the person who says nothing meaningful, but uses the perfect, approved language of self-abnegation, the proxy self-perfected. The man who manages to maintain a 5.0 rating on the internal, "How did this person make me feel?" metric, regardless of his actual output, is the system's chosen successor. This institutionalized fear of friction ensures that everything moves slower, nothing is truly risked, and the most dangerous individuals, the brilliant, uncompromising minds, are systematically neutralized or driven out. This process, repeated across entire industries, is the brutal proof of internal psychological failure manifesting as global societal anemia. The man who fears his own shadow casts that shadow over the entire organization, turning it into a monument to his repressed mediocrity. We are watching the aggressive mediocrity of the self-censor becoming the reigning organizational principle, transforming productive environments into therapeutic collectives whose primary output is process, not product. If you are finding this analysis resonates, if you believe that confronting these deep structural truths, rather than merely complaining about the symptoms, is necessary for real change, then I urge you to subscribe. Your support is the only way channels dedicated to delivering deep, unflinching psychological content can sustain themselves against the prevailing tide of superficiality. The man who has successfully outsourced his self-governance to external validation requires external enemies to validate his internal stagnation. He cannot admit he chose the easy, approved path. Therefore, the path he abandoned must be demonized. This requires a profound cognitive distortion, the constant misidentification of courage as cruelty. When he sees someone successfully asserting boundaries, refusing to apologize for their competence, or taking a visible controversial stance, he experiences not inspiration, but existential threat. He sees the shadow of the man he could have been, and his immediate automatic response is to launch a moralizing smear campaign. His internal voice screams, "You are making me look bad by being good." And that scream is translated into the public demand, "You are toxic and must be silenced for the good of the community." He does not want the other man to fail. He wants the other man to internalize the same crushing sense of guilt and compromise that he did. This explains the relentless, disproportionate fury aimed at any figure who achieves success while maintaining an irreverent, self-directed stance. He weaponizes empathy, deploying the language of trauma and vulnerability to disarm and paralyze any healthy, competitive aggression. He understands that if he can convince the successful man that his success is morally tainted, that his drive is merely a symptom of unexamined privilege, he can force that man to begin the same tragic process of self-cancellation that defined his own life. The entire culture is therefore being subtly pressured into a collective state of preemptive self-betrayal, where the greatest reward is the absence of criticism, and the greatest risk is the achievement of genuine independent selfhood. This brings us to the great contemporary lie, the lie that underpins this entire cultural operation. The institutionalized veneration of emotional fragility. We have been expertly conditioned to confuse intellectual challenge with personal assault, mistaking the necessary friction of growth for toxicity, and demanding that the highest ethical goal of any community is absolute emotional safety. This isn't safety. This is the organized enforcement of intellectual cowardice. The man who fears the gaze of the independent observer, the man who lives in terror of being judged and found wanting, demands the world be constructed as a massive, padded safe space where critique is vandalism and rigor is violence. He doesn't want vulnerability, he wants indemnity. He leverages the rhetoric of trauma precisely because he knows it is the only guaranteed moral trump card remaining in the deck, granting immediate, unearned authority and placing his critics in the immediate, indefensible position of being cruel. But true strength, true moral fiber, is forged in confrontation, in the willingness to stand exposed to the gale force winds of criticism and controversy without immediately collapsing into a state of demanded care. The sensitive man is thus not morally superior. He is often just the man who has skillfully avoided every crucible that might have tempered his soul. He has opted out of the painful process of individuation and now requires the surrounding environment to constantly validate his stagnation. If the world is allowed to be sharp, competitive, and demanding, he loses his primary alibi for failure. Therefore, the first duty of the modern man is no longer achievement, but the ritualistic avoidance of offense. The true revolution is not political or economic. It is the quiet, psychological revolution that convinces a generation that avoiding discomfort is the defining characteristic of a good life. They have convinced millions that the absence of pain is the presence of meaning, and this fatal confusion is the engine driving the mass self-cancellation we are witnessing. To dissect this intricate cultural architecture, to identify the precise psychological mechanisms that turn well-meaning people into agents of ideological enforcement, requires a level of unflinching analysis that almost no mainstream content is willing to touch. If you value this depth, if you recognize the difference between mere commentary and the excavation of uncomfortable truths, then I urge you to subscribe now. The price of admission into this fragile, protected collective is the public performance of repentance. The successful man, the achieving man, must constantly flagellate himself with the language of apology, confessing his unexamined privilege and ritualistically denouncing the very drive that made him successful in the first place. This is not genuine introspection. It is preventative self-abasement, a prophylactic measure against the inevitable moralizing attack. He must demonstrate that he is not a threat to the reigning dogma of collective compromise. This performative guilt becomes the only currency accepted by the externally validated man, who desperately needs to see the successful man compromise his own foundation to justify his own life of silent submission. If the successful man refuses to apologize, if he stands unapologetically in his competence, he doesn't just invite criticism, he invites the full annihilating force of the cultural machine, because he represents a fundamental existential contradiction. The proof that self-directed aggression and unapologetic achievement are not necessarily immoral, but potentially the highest form of self-respect. The entire societal mechanism is thus geared toward transforming internal integrity into external shame. This shame is the key lubricant of the machine, because it is immediately transactional. For the self-abasing individual, the payoff is the temporary de-escalation of existential threat. They trade a sliver of their authentic self for the privilege of remaining within the protective walls of the consensus, believing that self-mutilation is preferable to total social annihilation. But the true engine of enforcement is found in the psychology of the accuser, the person who profits purely from the moralizing act. For the chronically unachieving, the resentful, or the morally insecure, the act of denunciation offers an instantaneous, intoxicating injection of moral capital without the necessity of actual competence or contribution. They do not have to build a better argument, or a better life, or a better product. They simply have to identify and prosecute a perceived flaw in someone else, particularly someone successful, and they are instantly elevated. Judgment becomes a zero-cost replacement for achievement. This is the purest form of spiritual arbitrage, converting the deep, complex integrity of another person into cheap, immediate virtue for oneself. This dynamic creates a perverse inverted hierarchy of moral standing, where the loudest, most aggressive prosecutor of ideological trespass assumes temporary dominance, effectively renting the moral high ground. This temporary ascendancy masks a profound underlying psychological insecurity, where the moralizer's true obsession is not with justice for the victim they claim to represent, but with the temporary escape from the crushing weight of their own inadequacy. By focusing outward on the perceived sins of the successful, they are granted a momentary reprieve from the requirement to look inward at their own compromised ambition or lack of self-discipline. They become addicted to this cycle, perpetually scanning the horizon for the next target, because the moment the outrage fades, they collapse back into the void of their own unresolved lives. The entire culture thus organizes itself around providing an unlimited supply of high-status targets to feed the low-status need for manufactured moral superiority. The inevitable consequence of this psychological exchange is the mass incentivization of intellectual cowardice. If clarity and competence are dangerous signals that invite attack, then ambiguity and studied confusion become survival tools. The individual learns to speak in qualifiers, to hedge every statement with disclaimers, and to preemptively surrender any definitive stance that might contradict the shifting ideological weather patterns. Truth in this environment is not merely risky, it is a liability. The greatest tragedy is that this doesn't just silence dissidents. It fundamentally reshapes the interior landscape of those who comply. They internalize the censor. They begin to perform perpetual surveillance on their own consciousness, killing off thoughts and ideas at the source, not because they are wrong, but because they are inconvenient or potentially antagonistic to the prevailing narrative of victimhood and apology. This self-censorship is the ultimate psychological prison, far more effective than external enforcement, because it turns the individual into their own warden, eliminating the possibility of genuine, high-friction, productive thought. If you find this dissection of the machinery of cultural control painful but absolutely necessary, if you recognize the effort it takes to articulate these hidden social contracts that bind us, then please consider subscribing now to support this kind of essential, uncompromised analysis, and ensure it can continue to reach those who need it. We are watching a generation voluntarily trade the hard-won freedom of intellectual autonomy for the illusory comfort of belonging. They confuse agreement with safety and mistake silence for wisdom. This is the psychological mechanism underpinning the great cultural contraction. When faced with the choice between self-respect and social inclusion, the modern, externally validated individual chooses inclusion every single time, even if the price is the gradual, ritualistic dismantling of their own soul. The system ensures that the most ambitious, the most articulate, and the most competent are the first to be neutralized, because their unapologetic existence is the greatest threat to the moralizers who derive their only sense of meaning from the prosecution of failure. The only way to win in this new environment is to be invisible, or to be perceived as broken and needing collective rescue, thereby validating the rescuer's own temporary moral mandate. The final devastating verdict on this safety-obsessed culture is that it successfully eliminates conflict, but only by eliminating the very possibility of selfhood. It demands that we become an echo chamber for the fears of others, leaving us fundamentally alone, yet surrounded by millions of ghosts performing the same empty ritual of compliance. The work required to resist this psychological colonization is immense, and it demands a community dedicated to unvarnished truth. If you see the value in fighting back against the subtle coercion of consensus, then join us by subscribing now. The pursuit of absolute safety is the definition of spiritual suicide. It is the refusal to accept the foundational existential truth that conflict and friction are not just necessary for growth, but are the very definition of a life lived. We have engineered the perfect prison, one where the walls are made of soft cushions and the bars are woven from mutual affirmation. The final verdict on this obsession with eliminating intellectual and emotional discomfort is brutal. The safety culture does not save you from hardship. It merely guarantees that when hardship inevitably arrives, you will have zero internal resources left to meet it. It turns pain into catastrophe because you were taught that pain was an avoidable error, not a fundamental feature of existence. You were raised to be fragile, and fragility is moral ammunition for those who seek to control you. The moralizers don't want you to be strong. They want you dependent on their definition of acceptable suffering and acceptable thought. This is the existential trap of the modern age, trading the terrifying burden of genuine freedom, the freedom to be wrong, to be despised, to be difficult, for the tranquilized oblivion of collective correctness. Your only reliable defense against this totalizing softness is the conscious cultivation of internal difficulty. Seek out the cognitive dissonances you were taught to flee. Embrace the positions that require you to lose something, status, comfort, or belonging, in order to gain everything, your own judgment. Stop asking if your thought is safe or acceptable and start asking if it is true and necessary. The ultimate rebellion is not loudness or anger. It is the silent, terrifying choice to become robust, self-defined, and utterly uninterested in the applause of the crowd you have intellectually outgrown. This is the community we are building here, a refuge for those who prioritize clarity over comfort and truth over tribal loyalty. If you have recognized the hidden mechanism of your own domestication and are ready to dedicate yourself to the brutal, beautiful task of rebuilding your intellectual sovereignty, then make that commitment concrete. If you want to continue this essential, difficult conversation, this unsparing scrutiny of the culture that tries to define us, then join the community now. Click the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and ensure you do not miss the next transmission from the intellectual front lines. The world needs fewer echoes and more independent minds. Be one of them. The final freedom is realizing you don't need the external world to affirm your worth or validate your sight. It is the definitive understanding that the soft collective safety offered by conformity is, in reality, a contract that demands your soul in exchange for temporary psychological convenience. The definitive verdict on the modern condition is this: the systems of control, whether political, social, or technological, rely entirely on your internal terror of isolation. They function only because you prioritize the warmth of the herd over the chilling, absolute necessity of independent truth. Therefore, the only true resistance, the only reliable path to personal sovereignty, is the systematic, relentless practice of intellectual self-sufficiency. You must make yourself financially, emotionally, and cognitively resilient to social exile. This is the ultimate existential defense. Don't strive to be liked. Strive to be necessary, first to yourself, and then to the small, fiercely independent circles that genuinely value clarity over comfort. The applause of the crowd fades, but the judgment of your own conscience remains. Do not allow your internal ledger to be written in the cheap currency of social approval. Write it in ironclad truth, in the evidence of self-mastery, and in the difficult courage of having seen the world as it is, not as you wish it to be. The burden of genuine freedom is heavy, yes, but it is infinitely lighter than the chains of quiet desperation and internalized falsity. If you recognize this profound, necessary separation, if you are prepared to trade manufactured happiness for authentic struggle and temporary belonging for permanent clarity, then you understand that the hard work is just beginning. This is where those minds gather. If you want to commit to the ongoing, essential work of intellectual warfare against the forces of conformity and convenience, and join a community dedicated not to ease but to the brutal, beautiful elevation of the mind, then ensure your commitment is counted. Click subscribe, join the vigilance, and let us continue this difficult conversation. The final verdict is simple. You are not owed comfort. You are only owed the capacity to know the truth. And that capacity is forged in isolation. Remember this: the world will always try to sell you consensus and distraction. Your greatest legacy will be the places where you refused that cheap bargain and stood alone, clear-eyed and unyielding. If you are one of the few who prefer the burden of reality to the comfort of the lie, then make sure your commitment is counted. Subscribe now, join the vigilance, and let us meet again where the truth lives, outside the walls, outside the